Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at deborahrrichardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the annual plan and also to download a training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. So if you and your vendor team are accepting vendor supporting documents via email, then one, you're not alone, but two, you know you are susceptible to email fraud. Now, I'm doing something a bit different in this episode to provide you with a lightning round of tips. So, keep listening. Welcome to episode 170, Avoid Email Fraud in the Vendor Process, 20 Tips in 20 Minutes. All right, so like I said before, I'm doing something a little bit different in this episode. I am going to replay a webinar that I had late last year to talk about three things really: giving tips to avoid business email compromise scams, giving tips to avoid gift card scams, and then giving tips to avoid credential theft. And so between those three topics, there were 20 tips in 20 minutes. And I thought it would be great to do a replay here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in that audio, and you'll notice the change. I will also put a link in the show notes so that you can link out to where you can download the presentation. And then if you would like to watch the actual recording so you can see the slides, then you can do that as well. So without further ado, here is the webinar recording. All right, well, welcome to today's live webinar, Avoid Email Fraud in the Vendor Process, 20 tips in 20 minutes. I'm going to try to have 5 minutes on either side for introductions and kind of explaining how I got to this webinar, and then also some time at the end for your questions. Now, before we get started, some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording within 3 days, but most likely it'll be tomorrow. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. They will be saved for the Q&A session, and if I don't get to all of them, I will answer them via email within 24 hours. And then don't forget to download a PDF of the presentation, and I also have my brochure for more trainings and resources in the handout section. Now, a little bit about me before we get started. I am Deborah Richardson. You may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in Happy. That is also the name of my podcast. Now, as a previous AP Senior Manager of Global Vendor Maintenance, I was responsible for a team of 17 processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month and maintaining 140,000 active global vendor records across 7 different ERPs. Now, along with the payroll manager, since that was the other area where cyber criminals were applying social engineering tactics, we implemented over 70 internal controls and best practices to mitigate fraud for our AP and payroll teams. I now work with AP vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices that eliminate fraud, regulatory fines, and bad vendor data. All right, so let's take a look at the agenda. We will open this up looking at how cyber criminals are evolving in your email. And then we'll start the 20 tips in 20 minutes for avoiding email fraud in the vendor process with tips for 3 different types of email fraud. Tips to avoid business email compromise, then tips to avoid gift card scams, and then tips to avoid credential theft. And I want to do that in 20 minutes or so, leaving time for questions. All right. So I recently had a guest on my podcast, episode 151, talking about email security. And he said that controls that your security team or IT team put into place stop about 85% of fraudulent emails. And I am sure that you have processes in place that you use to deal with the other 15% that actually make it through. And those processes are put into place to avoid business email compromise scams, gift cards scams, and credential theft. And why am I really focusing on those 3? That's because business cyber criminals are evolving and they make the avoidance of these scams harder. And so let's look at that. So the first process that you most likely have in place is checking the email domain. So you probably check for those extra letters, those subtle misspellings, but it's not even about that anymore. Fraudsters or cyber criminals are using a play on letters, a capital I for lowercase l, or a double V for a W. So it makes it harder for you to spot that fraudster or cyber criminal trying to perpetrate a business email compromise scam. The next one is, do you know if that email requesting a gift card is really from your boss? So I bet most everyone here has an external email indicator that comes in your inbox. Well, if you haven't heard, cyber criminals can use CSS and HTML coding to remove that external email indicator. So now you don't know if that really is your boss sending you that request for gift cards, if you're only relying on the lack of an external email indicator. So this is a big issue if you're trying to avoid gift card scams. And then lastly, are you entering your credentials into a fraudulent website? Well, remember when that padlock on the address bar indicated that the site was safe? Not anymore. Security Boulevard reported in 2019 that more than half of all phishing sites had that padlock indicating that the site was secure. Now, this is a huge issue since you need to avoid credential theft. Now, if you're in accounts payable, procurement, treasury, governance teams, or any teams where you add or change vendors through all the way through making payments to vendors. This really makes you susceptible to business email compromise or perhaps processing transactions for internal activities. That makes you susceptible to gift card scams, both of which could require you to sign in to various sites to complete whatever transaction or process you're doing, thus leaving you open for a credential theft. And it's not easy for these team members, right? It's not easy for you to ignore attachments or links. That's really your job, right? You receive banking and other vendor data via email to add or change a vendor. You receive emails from internal employees making requests for payments. You receive links and emails to log into a portal or download a utility bill or complete a payment. So the question now is, what can you do to avoid email fraud? But before we get there, I'm going to launch the one and only poll that we have in today's webinar. And let me go ahead and get that. Okay, and let me launch it. All right, so poll question. How many emails do you get in in a day. And if you manage a generic email box like ap@yourcompany.com, you can respond with those volumes. So is it 200 plus? Is it 100 to 200? Is it 50 to 100, or is it less than 50? So this is a quick poll. I'll give you about 15 more seconds to go ahead and answer that. It would be very interesting to see what volumes you guys are dealing with. All right, so about 5 more seconds. Go ahead. It looks like we have over half has voted. So if you haven't voted, go ahead and get your vote in really quick, and then I will share the poll. All right, so we're getting close. More than 75%. I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you guys for voting. So let me close that. All right, so looks like we got 86% that voted. And so let's take a look at the results. So we have 43%, looks like the highest, have 50 to 100 emails per day. And then we have 30%, 100 to 200 emails per day. And then 17% have 200 or more per day. And then 10% has less than 50. So the majority, 50 to 100. Oh, but that 200 or plus per day. This webinar really for everyone. This webinar is for you, because even if you're in the 10% with the less than 50%, it only takes that one email to perpetrate fraud. So let me go ahead and close that, and then we will continue on with the webinar. All right, so now we're done with that piece, and that brings us right to 20 tips to avoid email fraud in the vendor process, right? What you can do with those 15% or so of emails that get through your IT or security controls. All right, so let's go. All right, so tips to avoid business email compromise scams. And in a business email compromise or BEC scam, criminals can send an email message that appears to come from a known source, making a legitimate request. Now, in the vendor process, this means that they're trying to make a request to change the banking or remit address, because it can be a check payment fraud as well, in order to divert vendor payments. So let's look at some tips to avoid that. All right, so the first thing I do want to say is that no one, not even you, are ever going to be 100% to catch these emails every day, all day, which we have already seen. Fraudsters are finding new ways all the time to get past our normal standbys of checking emails. So tip number one, and I think this is a very important tip, is to have management to just avoid the expectation that you're going to get a request from management. I worked for Verizon as an AP senior manager while Lowell McAdam was the CEO, and at no time did Lowell reach out to me and tell me to pay anyone. So remove that expectation so that you or your team members do, so that if you receive an email from who you think is leadership to change banking or make that urgent payment, it's immediately seen as a red flag and not a moment to please, right? All right, so that's one. The second thing is authentication of the requesters, whether it's your vendors or an internal employee contacting AP or submitting documents on the behalf of the vendor, and then also authentication of data. So for your requesters, again, be it the vendor or internal employee, think about this. When you call your bank, do they just talk to you about your account? No, they don't. They ask you 2 to 3 identifying questions to authenticate you are who you say you are, and you need to do the same thing with your vendors and your internal employees. So ask them 2 to 3 identifying questions like an invoice number and the last 4 digits of the existing bank account number, especially if they are an existing vendor trying to change their bank account. And the same thing with internal employees if they do not email from their company work mail. And we saw that a lot during COVID. Not sure if you're still experiencing that or not. But even then, even if they do email you from the company work mail, their email could have been hacked and the fraudster could have removed the external email indicator, so you don't really know who you are talking to. So ask them something like their cubicle or office number and maybe the next 2 level ups on their hierarchy. The next thing is authenticating data if they're making changes. So now that you have authenticated the requester, use authenticating data to match against the existing vendor record data. Are they making a banking change? Then require the existing banking information. And if you get pushback, then you have to wonder that if they don't have the authority to provide the existing vendor data, vendor banking data, do they really have the authority to change it? Now, the next one is require a company branded ACH form and collect all that authenticated data that you're asking on a company branded ACH form. You can still collect the voided check and the banking information on your vendor's letterhead or bank letterhead, although those can be forged. So instead of or also require a company branded ACH form and only give it to the vendors or internal employees to give to the vendors that actually authenticate. Change it every year and definitely do not put it on your website. That way, if you receive an older version from a vendor, right, it's a red flag because you know that you didn't just authenticate them. Otherwise, they would have the correct and updated version of the form. All right, the next one is the old standby, that confirmation phone call. And this one is really recommended anywhere you look, and it's not bad. You confirm with the vendor using information already on the vendor record, not from the email request, and preferably with a contact that did not initiate the request. But those that actually do this step, they know that it's, excuse me, much harder in practice because vendors don't always answer on that first call. So you need to track it, maintain a confirmation log, and capture the attempts. This can also be used to follow up on that second, third, maybe the fourth call by other employees with the original team member, or when the original team member that that called is out. And it's also great for management to track still pending requests before they exceed the stated turnaround times. Now, the last one is validate bank account ownership. You want to verify that the vendor legal name matches the bank account holder for that bank account number. Now, there are a few different ways to do this. You can do a pre-note. However, not all banks will return the bank account holder name. So you really can't use that to verify against your vendor's legal name. You can also do a micro deposit and have the vendor send a screenshot that includes the name and the deposit amount. But that can take a few days to complete. You can also take advantage of third-party providers like Early Warning and GAIAC that can validate the ownership of the bank account by matching the vendor legal name against the bank account holder name for that bank account number. And they do that by using a database that U.S. banks contribute depositor information to. And because of that, it's only available for U.S. banks or U.S. vendors that have, or vendors that have U.S. banks. And then there is a company called NSKnox that can do the same, except they have the vendor trigger a pre-note process, which means they can provide validation of bank account ownership for any bank, not just U.S. banks, but also non-U.S. banks as well. All right, so Now, if for some reason authentication does not work and it's still that fraudster still slips by, or maybe your team members are not following the authentication or the other steps, they're not following that process, you still need to add those internal controls and best practices to prevent that fraudulent payment. And so the first one is least privilege access. So this is number 6. Now, this means not only giving access or only giving access to those that actually need to add vendors in the vendor master file or need to change existing vendor data. For everyone else, they don't need to have access to the vendor sensitive data, which is their bank account information and their tax ID. Could be their birth date if you're collecting it based on some country requirements, but they don't need access to that. And if you think about it, how great it is that, you're training your vendor team, you're attending this webinar, doing some other things to authenticate the vendors to prevent fraud. But then the fraudsters turn around and contact Helpful Sally, right, in another department. And then she turns around with her access and gives them what they need to authenticate, right? So that's an example of why you need to practice least privileged access. The next one is to mask sensitive information. And before you say, but AP needs access, right, to the tax ID to post the invoice, to the right vendor number. And if they have a system like PeopleSoft, they need the bank account number to identify that they're using the right location. But you can only give them access to view the last 4 or 5 digits of the tax ID. That's enough to post an invoice, and only give them the last 4 or 5 digits of the bank account number. That's enough to find the correct location to select for the payment. The next one is require management approval. This is more for a compensating control when there's a segregation of duties issue, but you can still use that and require management approval for new vendor adds and or existing vendor changes. But make sure they really look at it and not like when they approve an expense report. Make sure the vendor team attaches the supporting documentation, the validations, and the email that requested the add or change so that the manager can review. Or if that is too much, review specific invoices prior to releasing payments. Say all invoices over $50,000, or if you're a large company, maybe you bump that up to $300,000 or $500,000, and look at those that fit that threshold and that have also recently had a remittance change. And again, any remittance change, because it can still be a check payment fraud along with a ACH fraud when they try to change the bank account. And then number 10 is to send a notification to the vendor. So the same way that Hulu, Netflix, Amazon, and your bank sends you a notification every time a change is made to your record, send one to your vendors, even if it's just via mail because you don't have an email address on file. It can still be quicker than waiting on the vendor to wait to notice that their payment is missing. And then call you when it's definitely too late to recover the funds. So you may be able to get a vendor to respond even before you generate the payment, saving you the hassle of the process to recover the funds. All right, the next one, let me go ahead, is tips to avoid gift card scams. So gift card scams are when someone asks you to pay for something that by putting money on the gift card, like Amazon, Google Play, or iTunes card, and then ask you to give them the numbers on the back of the card. So let's take a look at some tips to avoid this. And it's really funny is that, right, we buy gift cards even for our internal team members or for our company buys gift cards because they're easy. And if you think about it, they're easy for fraudsters too. And so the number 11, the tip for avoiding gift card scams. So the first one is, again, management avoid expectations. So just like business email compromise, avoid the expectation that it's even possible that management will contact an employee for gift cards. Why have the employee spend petty cash if you still have it, or even their own money for a gift card? Again, the expectation itself should be a red flag. The next thing is gift cards are for gifts, not payments. You may get a call from the IRS or utility company saying you have to pay taxes or a fine, or threaten to cut off your company's utilities. Gift cards are for payments, so this request should be a red flag. Now, if you have to buy gift cards, make sure you use trusted merchants. Stick to stores you know and trust. Avoid buying from online auction sites because the gift cards may be fake or stolen. And check it out before you buy it. Make sure the protective stickers, if you're in a physical store, make sure that they're on the card and that they do not appear to be tampered with. Also, check that the PIN number on the back isn't showing, and get a different card if you spot a problem. Now, if you have been scammed, tip number 15 is, if you've been scammed, you paid a scammer with a gift card, tell the company that issued the card right away. When you contact the company, tell them the gift card was used in a scam and ask them if they can refund your money. If you act quickly enough, the company might be able to get your money back. Also, tell the store where you bought the gift card as soon as possible. And now moving on to tips to avoid credential theft. So credential theft is just that. Cyber criminals find a way to get you to enter your credentials into a fake or phishing site with the intent to reuse your login information to access and then abuse or exfiltrate critical data and information. All right, so tip number 16. First, I do want to say that in a 2017 study, it found that the average person is likely to have 100 passwords. 100 plus passwords. So you likely have 100 plus passwords to remember. And as a result of that, they are reused, and the cyber criminals love this. So tip number 16 is a password manager. So use password managers to remember all your different passwords so you don't have to. If you get a link to a website that you need to log into, don't click from the link, rather launch it from the password manager versus clicking that link in the email. Plus, if you land on a site and it autofills, it's credible that it's probable that it's your actual site and not a spoofed website. Now, if you don't know if your company allows it, have that conversation with your IT or security team or leadership. The next tip, number 17, is whois.net. So if you are suspicious, copy and paste, not type, but copy and paste the email domain into the search field of whois.net. The results will be information on this website, including the date registered. So if apple.com has a capital I for the L and comes back with a recent date registered, that is a red flag that you are dealing with a phishing site. The next one, number 18, is multi-factor authentication. So I know much has been written about how to get around MFA, but it is still an additional layer of evidence that could prove that the cyber criminal is not you. So turn it on wherever it's available. The next tip, number 19, is public email address. So don't use your company email for personal business. Don't use your personal email for company business. Also, don't use your personal email for public business. Get a public email address to register on public forums, chat rooms, or subscribe to mailing lists. And don't be afraid to change it often. If you use several public email addresses for specific purposes, you have a better chance of identifying which services may be selling your address to spammers. And then the last one, number 20, is to share and report. Don't forward the email. but share the email in a screenshot with your colleagues because fraudsters tend to send the same email to multiple employees at the same company, and those other employees may not have gotten to it in their inbox yet. And then once you share it, make sure you report it. Follow your company policy, which hopefully includes reporting it to the proper authorities, such as the FBI or the IRS, if it's a tax-related scam. And then lastly, I do want to say on that note, here are some resources to find new scams and trends and share this with your team members as well. You can even subscribe to my new scam alerts so you're always notified when I post them on my site, which since 2020 has been about 2 to 3 per week, and sometimes more. All of those ways that I talked about cyber criminals evolving at the beginning of the webinar were scam alerts on my site, so make sure you sign up.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that replay of the webinar. I spared you all of the questions and the asking for questions. First of all, I talked too much, and in that half an hour webinar, I think I had 3 minutes left for questions, and the only question that came up in that short time was about the handouts. So that's a perfect time to remind you that in the show notes, I will have a link to this webinar on my site where you can both download the handout, which is just a PDF of the presentation, and then you could also click the link to watch the recording either on YouTube where it has timestamps, or you can watch it on the GoToWebinar platform. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 170th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.